Perfume and blood do not mix. Yet in Nero's court, they clung to the same air. Step inside the palace, and the first assault was not fear, but fragrance. Walls soaked in incense, tables sagging under exotic spices, fountains of wine spilling across marble floors. Suetonius, in the 12 Caesars, wrote of feasts so excessive that blossoms rained from ceilings and guests drowned under the weight of roses. But beneath this orchestrated paradise, every laugh carried hesitation, every glance held calculation. The splendor was not for comfort, it was camouflage. Rome had always celebrated power with display, but Nero weaponized display itself. Velvet banquets were stages where loyalty was tested and silence became survival. Those who failed to admire, to flatter, to laugh at the right cue risked more than embarrassment. They risked elimination. The gilded halls became a psychological experiment in classical conditioning. Reward and terror interlaced. A smile might bring you jewels, a hesitation might summon poison. Like Pavlov's dogs centuries later, Nero's courtiers were trained to respond instinctively, stripped of dignity until obedience felt like instinct. The paradox was intoxicating. Pleasure was forced, even mandatory. To refuse luxury was to insult the emperor. To embrace it was to drown in complicity. Historians have long debated whether Nero's extravagance was mere narcissism or a calculated performance of dominance. What's clear is this: every detail of the palace, from the golden mosaics to the perfumed torches, reminded the court that they were inside Nero's world, a space where beauty concealed brutality. Imagine sitting at those endless feasts, the room thick with perfume and smoke. Behind the music, behind the laughter, lingered an unspoken truth. The more dazzling the display, the sharper the shadow it cast. The grandeur was not just indulgence. It was theater designed to keep men uneasy, unsure of where admiration ended and terror began. But behind the golden curtains, the court was not merely indulging in pleasure. It was perfecting the art of psychological terror. Power is rarely silent, and in Nero's Rome, it sang. The emperor was not content with statues or decrees. He demanded the stage. Night after night, torchlight flickered across marble courtyards transformed into theaters. Senators in stiff robes, generals hardened by campaigns, and nobles accustomed to commanding thousands now found themselves reduced to trembling spectators, forced to applaud a man who would not stop playing the lyre. Tacitus, with his usual disdain, recorded how Nero compelled Rome's elite to endure endless recitals. They were not permitted to leave, not even when exhaustion or sickness set in. Some feigned death to escape. Others, according to rumor, threw themselves from balconies rather than risk being seen yawning. What looks to us like vanity was in truth a performance of dominance. The message was clear. If Rome's proudest men could be broken into clapping marionettes, no one was beyond the emperor's control. This was humiliation weaponized. Psychologists today call it learned helplessness. When repeated, unavoidable exposure to discomfort teaches the subject that resistance is futile. Nero understood instinctively what centuries later researchers like Martin Seligman would formalize: break the will, and obedience follows. Each strum of the lyre was another lash on the dignity of Rome's ruling class. Applause became not praise but surrender. The deeper cruelty lay in the inversion of roles. In the theater, Nero was not merely emperor, he was actor, singer, god of spectacle. His courtiers, meanwhile, were cast as his captive audience, their status inverted, their power neutralized. The performance was no longer art but ritual, an emperor displaying his divinity and an aristocracy forced to kneel through ovation. Control did not come through swords, but through rhythm and applause. Consider the psychology of the crowd. Even unwilling, collective clapping creates unity. Those who struck their palms together became bound in complicity, even as resentment festered. Group pressure silenced dissenters. Mob mentality disguised as entertainment transformed Rome's nobility into a choir of obedience. Where fear silenced tongues, spectacle synchronized them. And yet, there was a darker brilliance. By presenting himself as performer, Nero blurred the line between emperor and artist, authority and spectacle. If his rule was questioned, he could feign innocence, who would fear a man who only sings. But the nobles knew better. The theater was no escape from politics. It was politics. Applauding the emperor's voice was indistinguishable from applauding his reign. To withhold clapping was treason. The result was a paradox. Senators left these recitals humiliated but alive. Survival meant complicity. And complicity, repeated night after night, became a habit as binding as chains. The nobles learned the lesson Nero wanted etched into their bones. Rome did not belong to generals or to tradition, or even to law. Rome belonged to him, and he could command them not only with decree but with melody. Beneath the music, then, was a silence louder than any instrument, the silence of a court that had learned to clap on command. They laughed at the wrong moment, praised with hollow mouths, and in that hollowing their power drained. Nero's theater was not about art, nor even about ego. It was about control. And yet, Nero's greatest role was not on stage. It was the manipulation of loyalty itself. Loyalty in Nero's Rome was not a shield. It was a test, and the test was written in blood. Every senator, every advisor, every member of his own family lived beneath a sword that could drop at the faintest whisper of disloyalty. The court, gilded in perfume and marble, became less a palace than a stage for ritual sacrifice. Nero demanded proof of loyalty not in deeds of service, but in the spectacle of betrayal and death. The conspiracy of Piso in AD 65 revealed just how far the emperor's paranoia had burrowed into the empire's veins. A network of senators, equestrians, and even soldiers plotted to remove Nero and crown Gaius Calpurnius Piso. The conspiracy failed, but Nero seized the chance to turn suspicion into a public purge. It was not enough to punish the guilty. He had to unmask the court itself, to demonstrate that even allies, even blood, could be cast as traitors. The result was a theater of fear where loyalty was constantly performed yet never trusted. Among the condemned stood Seneca, the philosopher who had once guided Nero's youth and shaped his mind. Tacitus describes the grim scene, soldiers arriving at Seneca's villa, the philosopher calmly accepting his fate. Ordered to end his own life, he opened his veins and delivered his final words to his secretaries, dictating lessons in endurance as his strength ebbed. What might have been the quiet dignity of a stoic death was transformed into another act in Nero's theater, proof that wisdom, counsel, and years of service could not protect even Rome's most revered mind from suspicion. If Seneca could fall, then all were vulnerable. The psychology behind such cruelty is chilling. Modern behavioral studies show that unpredictable punishment, sometimes called intermittent reinforcement, creates the deepest anxiety. When consequences arrive at random, when loyalty one day earns reward and the next brings ruin, the mind learns helplessness. Nero wielded this principle like a blade. His courtiers never knew whether a smile would bring them favor or whether the same smile might be twisted into evidence of deceit. Suspicion was the constant, and fear was the leash. In such a climate, betrayal became contagious. Senators denounced colleagues before they themselves could be accused. Husbands condemned wives. Fathers distanced themselves from sons. The court corroded from within, each man hoping to prove loyalty by offering another's head. Nero did not need to invent enemies. His paranoia ensured that his subjects created them for him. Trust dissolved. replaced by a vicious economy where survival was purchased through denunciation. What Nero created was not simply a series of executions, but an atmosphere where loyalty itself was poisoned. To live was to betray, and to remain silent was to risk being read as guilty. The brilliance and the horror was that he did not need to kill everyone. He only needed to kill enough in irregular strokes to remind everyone that death could arrive at any time. The uncertainty did the rest, and so the court applauded, dined, and flattered with smiles stretched thin, each gesture hiding a heart pounding with dread. They were alive not because they were loyal, but because chance had not yet claimed them. But what made these purges so effective was not the deaths themselves. It was the fear of not knowing who was next. The sword was not Nero's sharpest weapon. It was the whisper. In his court, words carried more weight than steel. Rome under Nero became a city where silence was dangerous and speech was lethal, because every phrase might find its way into the ears of the delators, the informers who thrived in the cracks of fear. Tacitus, chronicler of imperial suspicion, described how these informers flourished in Nero's reign, feeding accusations to the emperor and feasting on the rewards. They were parasites, but parasites sanctioned by power. The state encouraged their vigilance, paying them with confiscated wealth of the condemned. Each denunciation was a performance, the informer stepping forward, the accused dragged down, the emperor watching as another rival fell. Court politics, once ruled by persuasion and patronage, were now reshaped by betrayal as a profession. The psychology is as timeless as it is chilling. Informers turned paranoia into an institution, embedding surveillance into daily life. The principle of social conformity under threat, well documented in modern studies, explains how individuals censor themselves when they believe they are being watched. Under Nero, the watching never stopped. Every banquet, every private conversation, every glance in the Senate chamber could become evidence. The effect was claustrophobic. Even loyalty expressed too eagerly might be read as insincere. Even neutrality was suspect. The brilliance of this system was that Nero did not need to monitor every voice. He only needed to create the belief that someone else would. The delators filled the spaces between eyes and ears, transforming Rome into a theater where every person was both actor and audience, playing roles for unseen judges. Fear spread horizontally from man to man as much as it flowed downward from the emperor himself. And yet, there was a deeper cruelty. Informers were not shadows lurking in alleys. They were senators, equestrians, even friends. Betrayal came not from the stranger, but from the familiar face at the banquet table. This collapse of trust eroded the very fabric of Roman elite life. In such a world, intimacy became danger and friendship a liability. Suspicion was not merely political, it was personal, gnawing at every bond. What emerged was a society where speech itself lost meaning. People learned to talk in half-truths, to flatter in circles, to choke their own words before they left their lips. The silence of Nero's court was not the peace of loyalty, but the hush of suffocated lives. And in this suffocating atmosphere, even silence could become a death sentence. In Nero's court, death often came not with the flash of a blade but with the quiet slip of a cup. Poison became the emperor's preferred language of elimination, silent, invisible, impossible to predict. Unlike execution, which was public and final, poison lingered in the imagination. Every sip of wine, every morsel of food carried the potential for betrayal. It was not just a tool of killing, it was an instrument of suspense. At the heart of this shadowed art stood Locusta, Rome's most notorious poisoner. Condemned for her crimes, she was spared and elevated under Nero's protection, transformed into a state asset. Suetonius records how she was employed to prepare lethal drafts for the emperor's enemies and rivals. Even Agrippina, Nero's own mother, was rumored to have felt the sting of Locusta's bruise, though her survival forced Nero to later rely on more brutal methods. Locusta's presence symbolized something darker than murder. It made poison an official arm of governance. Psychology offers insight into why poison terrifies more than steel. A sword is visible, its strike immediate. Poison, however, corrupts the very act of living. To eat, to drink, these are acts of trust, of necessity. By turning nourishment into danger, Nero introduced a form of conditioned anxiety. This is what psychologists today would call anticipatory dread, the fear not of the blow itself, but of its possibility at every moment. In such a climate, daily life becomes an experiment in terror. The court soon revolved around this uncertainty. Noblemen forced smiles at banquets, yet each course was shadowed by suspicion. Was the wine too bitter? Was the bread too soft? Even gifts of food became double-edged symbols, hospitality on the surface, threat beneath. Poison was not merely an act, it was a rumor, and the rumor did the work of 1,000 assassins. What made it so devastating was its invisibility. No one could predict who would fall or when. A man might raise a toast one night and collapse the next morning, his death whispered as natural, accidental, or convenient. Locusta's poisons blurred the line between fate and murder, creating a world where chance itself seemed under Nero's command. And in this world, trust withered. Every banquet was theater, every drink a gamble. By weaponizing uncertainty, Nero turned his court into a stage of suspense where no one felt secure, and where obedience was purchased not with loyalty, but with survival. But perhaps the darkest weapon in Nero's arsenal was not poison, it was spectacle. Flames do not discriminate, but power decides how the story of fire is told. In July of AD 64, Rome ignited. The Great Fire raged for 9 days, consuming temples, marketplaces, and homes until 2/3 of the city lay in ruins. Tacitus wrote of citizens fleeing with children in their arms, their cries drowned out by the roar of collapsing roofs. Cassius Dio described how the blaze moved with unnatural fury, as if guided by unseen hands. Whether or not Nero struck the spark mattered less than what he did next. He transformed catastrophe into theater. Rumors spread quickly that the emperor himself had sung as Rome burned, playing his lyre while the city crumbled. A story too perfect to ignore, though Tacitus himself admitted its uncertainty. Yet even the rumor was dangerous. If the people believed Nero had orchestrated their suffering, the empire could collapse under rage. The emperor needed not only to shift blame but to weaponize disaster. And so he found his scapegoat, a small, despised sect known as the Christians. Tacitus records with chilling detail how Nero accused them of arson, unleashing punishments so grotesque they blurred into spectacle. Christians were crucified, torn apart by dogs, or set aflame to serve as human torches illuminating the emperor's gardens. What should have been mourning became a grotesque pageant. By redirecting hatred, Nero deflected suspicion and reasserted his authority. The message was brutal. Rome would suffer, but not because of him. Rome would suffer because its enemies lurked within. Psychology calls this scapegoating, a defense mechanism that displaces collective fear and rage onto a vulnerable target. In moments of chaos, leaders often redirect blame to preserve legitimacy. Nero instinctively understood this principle centuries before Freud would give it language. By defining an other responsible for Rome's pain, he gave citizens not answers, but an outlet. Fear that might have turned toward the throne was instead funneled into violence against the marginalized. But there was another layer of brilliance. Fire destroys, but it also clears space. From the ashes of ruined districts, Nero began construction of his Domus Aurea, the Golden House, an opulent palace of staggering luxury. To his subjects, this was an insult carved into the very earth, while they rebuilt with ash still under their fingernails. He erected a monument to himself. And yet even here there was calculation. The palace stood as proof that from destruction came renewal, on Nero's terms. He alone could take Rome's agony and turn it into glory. The unease lingered. To citizens, the fire became both tragedy and lesson, tragedy in the lives and homes consumed, lesson in the emperor's ability to control even disaster. The horror was not merely in the flames but in the aftermath, the realization that catastrophe itself could be molded into propaganda. What began as a fire became something larger, a narrative of fear, blame, and control, a spectacle written not in marble or gold but in the very memories of those who survived. To live in Nero's Rome was to learn that nothing, not even disaster, escaped his theater. And with one stroke, Nero turned devastation into a new theater of fear. Not all prisons are built of stone. Some are built of velvet, wine, and gold. After the fire, Nero unveiled his Domus Aurea, the Golden House, an architectural masterpiece sprawling across land once filled with homes and temples. Its halls shimmered with gilded ceilings, its walls painted with mythic scenes, its gardens filled with artificial lakes and mechanical dining rooms where ceilings could rain blossoms and perfumes upon guests. It was not merely a palace. It was a world within a world designed to overwhelm the senses and drown resistance in luxury. The feasts that followed became legendary. Suetonius described banquets where tables groaned under delicacies from every corner of the empire, peacock tongues, oysters from Britain, flamingo brains. Guests reclined on couches, while music, dancers, and fountains of wine blurred the line between indulgence and intoxication. Yet beneath the seduction was strategy. By surrounding Rome's elite with endless pleasure, Nero achieved a subtler form of domination, desensitization. When the extraordinary becomes routine, the ability to resist weakens. Modern psychology identifies this as habituation, the process by which repeated exposure to stimulus dulls response. By flooding his court with excess, Nero ensured that shock, outrage, and even moral revulsion eroded with time. What might horrify once became expected. Senators who once prided themselves on discipline now measured loyalty in how long they could endure indulgence. In this world, virtue was suffocated by velvet, yet there was cruelty in the gift. To refuse Nero's hospitality was an insult, to accept it was complicity. Luxury became a trap. Each banquet blurred distinctions between ruler and ruled, between crime and pleasure. Guests left with jewels, estates, and favors, but also with the knowledge that their survival depended on compliance. The excess was not generosity. It was currency in an empire of fear. The Domus Aurea itself symbolized this paradox. Rising from the ashes of the great fire, it was both promise and insult, promise that Nero could remake Rome into paradise, insult that he had done so upon their ruins. The sheer scale of its splendor reminded all who entered that they were not simply guests. They were subjects in Nero's world, where reality bent to his design. It is easy to imagine the intoxication, reclining beneath gilded ceilings while petals drifted from above, wine clouding the senses, laughter echoing through perfumed halls. Yet under the surface pulsed a darker truth. These pleasures were not escape, but chains. Excess dulled vigilance, blurred outrage, and replaced defiance with dependency. But even luxury was not enough to hold the empire together when terror became the glue. Fear can hold a throne, but only for so long. By the end of his reign, Nero's instruments of control had sharpened into blades that cut both ways. Poison, spectacle, and humiliation had once kept Rome's elites paralyzed, but repetition dulled their terror. What began as awe transformed into resentment. The same nobles who once clapped at his recitals and trembled at his purges now whispered of his madness behind closed doors. Fear had not vanished. It had soured into hatred. Suetonius tells of Nero's final years with an edge of disbelief. The emperor who once dazzled audiences with song now wandered through Rome at night in disguise, brawling with commoners, desperate for thrills beyond the reach of his stage. His paranoia deepened. He imagined conspiracies in every corner, friends turning traitor, servants plotting revenge. The irony was cruel. In crafting a court built on suspicion, Nero had infected himself. The emperor became prisoner of his own theater, watching shadows instead of ruling men. The Senate, once humiliated into silence, began to stir. Governors in the provinces withheld obedience. Even his soldiers, the supposed backbone of his rule, faltered in loyalty. When rebellion flared under Galba in Spain, Nero discovered the limits of his empire of fear. Terror might silence a court, but it could not command distant legions whose loyalty had long since eroded. The emperor who once set the terms of life and death found himself begging for allegiance. Psychology explains this collapse. Power maintained solely by fear relies on a fragile equation, the belief that the ruler is untouchable. The moment cracks appear, when punishments feel erratic, when threats no longer land, the illusion shatters. What once terrified becomes ridiculous. The dictator becomes a clown. Scholars call this loss of legitimacy, but the experience is simpler. The spell breaks, and once broken, it cannot be recast. Nero's end was almost theatrical in its despair. As Suetonius recounts, when the Senate declared him a public enemy, Nero fled the city in disguise, abandoned even by the guards who once enforced his terror. Hiding in a villa, he heard the approaching hoofbeats of soldiers sent to seize him. Panicked, he grasped for courage but found only fear. His final words, trembling as he drove a dagger into his throat, were bitterly ironic. Qualis artifex perio, what an artist dies in me. Even in death, he clung to the fantasy of performance. Rome did not mourn. The city that once endured his feasts, his songs, his purges, breathed with relief. The man who had claimed their obedience through terror had discovered its fatal weakness. Fear can silence, but it cannot inspire. It corrodes loyalty until nothing remains but loathing. And when the spell broke, it revealed the fragility of power built only on fear. Death did not end Nero's reign. The Senate, desperate to close the chapter on his chaos, declared damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Statues of Nero were torn down, his name chiseled from inscriptions, his likeness defaced as though stone itself could be purged of his shadow. Official decrees insisted he had never truly ruled, that his presence in Rome's history was to be erased like a stain scrubbed from marble. To destroy the image was to destroy the legacy, or so they believed. Yet the paradox of memory is that suppression often preserves. Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio all recorded Nero's crimes in detail, ensuring that the emperor lived on in ink even as his face was hammered from monuments. Rumors sprang that Nero had not truly died, that he had fled east, that he would return with legions. 3 impostors rose in later years claiming to be the fallen emperor, and each drew desperate crowds. Erasure had failed. The more Rome tried to bury him, the more fascination bloomed in the cracks. Psychology calls this the Streisand effect. Attempts to censor or erase a figure can magnify their presence. By declaring Nero unspeakable, Rome made him unforgettable. His excesses, his violence, his final words. What an artist dies in me became fragments of legend repeated in whispers that outlived the marble inscriptions. The man they tried to delete became the ghost they could not escape. This was the final irony of Nero's theater. He achieved the immortality he craved, though not in the form he imagined. He was not remembered as a divine artist, nor as a golden emperor, but as the embodiment of what happens when fear and indulgence rule unchecked. In the attempt to erase him, Rome gave him the one role that could not be stripped away, that of cautionary myth. But if Rome tried to erase Nero, why do his shadows still haunt us today? Nero's reign ended in blood and disgrace, but the lessons of his court did not die with him. His crimes are more than historical scandal. They are a case study in how authoritarian power thrives, how it conditions obedience, and how fear becomes governance itself. From the forced applause of senators to the whispers of informers and the staged executions, Nero demonstrated principles of control that psychologists would later name. Pavlov showed that fear could be conditioned with a bell. Nero had proven centuries earlier that it could be conditioned with rumor, spectacle, and silence. Modern political psychology confirms what his court endured. Terror need not be constant to be effective. Intermittent punishment, unpredictable rewards and sudden punishments, creates the deepest compliance. Surveillance, whether through Nero's delators or today's digital monitoring, erodes trust until communities police themselves. Propaganda, whether sung through Nero's recitals or broadcast in headlines, blurs truth until obedience feels safer than doubt. The methods evolve, but the mechanics remain. The danger lies not in seeing Nero as a monster from another age, but in recognizing the familiarity of his tools. His use of spectacle to distract, scapegoating to unify, luxury to pacify, and terror to silence were not relics of Rome. They are recurring strategies in every era where power seeks to dominate the mind as well as the body. Authoritarianism does not begin with executions. It begins with applause demanded, with words censored, with fear turned inward. And so Nero's legacy lingers. His palace crumbled, his statues shattered, but the blueprint he left behind remains intact. Control the narrative, fracture trust, blur the line between performance and power. It is a warning carved not in marble but in memory, that when fear is weaponized, it does not merely shape politics, it reshapes the human spirit. Nero proved that power built on terror may fall, but the methods of fear remain eternal.